I was fired for policy violations. Then they begged me to save the company. I never thought I'd post something like this online, but it's been sitting in my chest for 2 years, and I still wake up angry about it. So here we are. This happened at a mid-sized healthcare tech company in the Midwest, the kind that brags about culture and mission while quietly burning out the people who actually keep the lights on. At the time, I was 36, divorced, and rebuilding my life after a messy split that left me with shared custody, a mortgage I couldn't refinance, and a job I believed would finally give me stability. I was hired as an operations manager, which sounds vague because it was, but in practice, it meant I was the person who fixed everything that broke, smoothed over every mistake, and quietly absorbed responsibilities no one else wanted. I was good at it too. Too good, in retrospect. My days started before sunrise with Slack messages and ended long after my daughter fell asleep. Laptop balanced on my knees while I promised myself I'd log off after just one more thing. My boss, Aaron, loved to tell people I was rock solid, which I thought was a compliment until I realized rocks don't get promoted. They just sit there holding everything up while others climb. Still, I believed in the work, in the idea that what we built actually helped hospitals function better, and I believed if I kept my head down long enough, it would pay off. That illusion cracked the day I was pulled into a conference room with HR under the pretense of a routine check-in, a phrase that now makes my stomach tighten. I remember noticing how the blinds were tilted shut and how my calendar invite had been marked private, small details that should have warned me something was wrong. Monique from HR smiled too widely and asked how I was doing, like we were catching up over coffee instead of sitting across from a printed document turned face down. Aaron wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when I knew whatever this was. It had already been decided without me. And the version of myself who thought loyalty mattered was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Monique finally slid the paper toward me like it might bite. And that's when Aaron cleared his throat and said they'd received a report that I was engaged in outside employment, the kind of phrase that sounds harmless until it's weaponized. And my first thought was my freelance consulting work I did late at night for a small nonprofit clinic, unpaid, because apparently helping overstretched nurses digitize schedules counted as suspicious now. I explained that immediately, calmly, even smiled a little, because I genuinely thought it was a misunderstanding that would be cleared up in 30 seconds if I just spoke like a rational adult. Monique nodded, tapping her pen, and said they weren't questioning my intentions, just my compliance, and Aaron added that the company had a strict policy against dual employment that could create conflicts of interest. I remember blinking at him, waiting for the punchline, because I hadn't signed anything prohibiting volunteer work, and the nonprofit wasn't even in the same market. That's when Monique flipped the document around and I saw the word termination at the top, bold and final, and my ears started ringing so loudly I almost missed Aaron saying the decision was effective immediately. I asked if there had been an investigation, if I could appeal, if anyone had actually looked at what I was doing, and Monique gave me that practiced HR look that says she's already moved on emotionally. She told me the report came from internal sources and that leadership had lost confidence in my judgment, which felt surreal given how often they relied on me to fix their own bad decisions. I laughed then, a short, ugly sound I didn't recognize as my own, and said, "So that's it." And Aaron finally looked at me with something like discomfort and said, "Security would walk me out." I thought about my daughter's lunchbox sitting on the counter at home, about the calendar reminders I'd set for projects that would now be finished by someone else, about how easily I was being erased. As I handed over my badge, I felt strangely light, like something heavy had been ripped out of me without anesthesia, and as the elevator doors closed behind me, I realized the worst part wasn't the firing itself. It was knowing someone inside that building had quietly decided I was expendable and never once had the courage to talk to me about it. I sat in my car for a long time after that, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the company logo etched into the glass doors like it had personally betrayed me. And I didn't cry until I tried to start the engine and realized I was shaking too hard to turn the key. The first person I called was my sister, not to vent, but to ask if she could pick up my daughter from school, because the logistics panic hit before the emotional one, and when she said, "Of course, no questions asked," something in me finally cracked. I drove home on autopilot, replaying the meeting over and over, wondering who had reported me and why now, and the more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that this wasn't about policy at all. 2 weeks earlier, I'd pushed back in a leadership meeting about an unrealistic rollout timeline that would burn out half the ops team, and Aaron had smiled thinly and said I was being negative. A week after that, I'd emailed finance documenting cost overruns tied directly to an executive pet project, and suddenly I was difficult. Sitting alone in my kitchen, staring at the magnet-covered fridge, I realized I'd crossed the invisible line women like me always cross eventually, the one where competence turns into inconvenience. By that evening, Slack had logged me out everywhere, my email bounced, and a group chat I'd built for crisis coordination disappeared like it had never existed. It was disturbing how fast I vanished. The next morning, while my daughter ate cereal and chatted about a spelling test, I updated my resume with numb efficiency, stripping years of late nights into bullet points that suddenly felt meaningless. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Jenna, a senior analyst I'd mentored, asking if I was okay and telling me things were already unraveling. Approvals stuck, vendors confused, leadership snapping at everyone. I typed back a careful, supportive response, then deleted it and sent a neutral, wishing you the best, instead, because I understood now that anything else would be unpaid emotional labor. That afternoon, an email hit my personal inbox from Aaron, short and oddly formal, asking if I'd be willing to consult on a transitional basis for a few weeks to help onboard my replacement. I laughed out loud, alone in my living room, because the audacity was almost impressive. They hadn't checked my side of the story before firing me, but now that the machine was grinding, they suddenly remembered I existed. For the first time since that conference room, I felt something other than shock. I felt clarity. I didn't respond to Aaron right away, mostly because I needed to sit with the rage without letting it make decisions for me, and partly because I wanted to see how long it would take before desperation overrode pride on their end. It took less than 24 hours. By the next morning, my phone was lighting up with missed calls from numbers I recognized, and a few I didn't. And when I finally listened to the voicemail from Monique, her tone had shifted from corporate-friendly to explained through clenched teeth polite. She said they were experiencing unexpected operational gaps and wondered if I might be open to a short-term consulting agreement to ensure business continuity. No apology, no acknowledgement of the way I'd been escorted out like a liability, just an assumption that I would step back in and save them because that's what I'd always done. I made coffee and listened to the message twice, then forwarded it to my sister with the caption, "You cannot make this up." The truth was, I needed money badly. My severance barely covered 2 months. My savings had been drained by legal fees from the divorce, and health insurance alone was going to be a nightmare. But I also knew this was the moment where the pattern either repeated or broke. I replied with a single sentence, saying I'd consider consulting under a formal contract with my own rates and scope, and within 10 minutes, Aaron called, suddenly friendly, suddenly using my first name like we were old pals. He talked fast, tripping over reassurances, saying how much the team missed me and how irreplaceable my institutional knowledge was, and I let him talk himself into a corner before calmly telling him my hourly rate was 3 times my previous pay, with a minimum weekly commitment paid up front. Silence stretched on the line long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then he exhaled sharply and said he'd need approval. Of course you do, I thought. An hour later, Monique emailed a contract that tried to cap my hours, restrict my communication, and include a non-disparagement clause so broad it would have muzzled me indefinitely. I sent it back with track changes and a note that said, "This doesn't work for me." The power shift was subtle but intoxicating. For the first time, I wasn't asking for permission to exist. I was setting terms. They came back the next day with a revised contract that magically addressed every issue I'd flagged, and that's when I knew someone higher up had finally realized how badly they'd miscalculated. I signed it without ceremony, emailed back a W-9, and made it very clear I would be working remotely, on my schedule, with communication limited to a single point of contact, because the last thing I needed was a dozen panicked Slack messages lighting up my phone at midnight. My first consulting call was chaos. Aaron sounded exhausted. Monique was overly cheerful in that brittle way people get when they're pretending not to panic, and 2 directors who'd barely acknowledged me before were suddenly praising my unique insight. I listened, took notes, and asked pointed questions that exposed how little had actually been transferred in the weeks since my departure. Processes I'd built intuitively over years had been reduced to half-finished flowcharts and misunderstood handoffs, and every time someone said, "Well, we thought it worked this way," I felt a grim sense of validation. What they really wanted wasn't onboarding help, it was my brain, and I was no longer willing to donate it for free. I delivered exactly what the contract outlined. No more, no less. Documenting fixes without absorbing responsibility for outcomes, and the discomfort in their voices was almost audible when they realized I wasn't going to jump in front of every moving train anymore. Meanwhile, word traveled. Former coworkers reached out quietly, asking how I was, slipping in comments about leadership scrambling and deadlines slipping, and I responded kindly but carefully, aware that nothing I said was truly private. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a call and closed my laptop, my daughter asked if I was still mad at my old job, and I surprised both of us by saying no. I wasn't mad anymore. I was alert. I was watching an organization choke on the absence of unpaid devotion, and for the first time, I understood that my firing hadn't been a failure of mine. It had been a test of how much disrespect I would tolerate, and I had finally stopped passing it. By the third week of consulting, the cracks were impossible to hide, and even from my side of the screen, I could feel the tension vibrating through every call like static. Deadlines slipped, vendors complained, and a system outage that would have once been a minor hiccup ballooned into a 2-day emergency because no one could agree on who owned the fix. I watched them flail with a strange mix of detachment and grief, because part of me still cared about the people grinding inside that mess, even if I no longer felt responsible for holding it together. Aaron started calling me outside our agreed hours, leaving rushed voicemails that sounded more like pleas than professional requests. And each time I waited until the next scheduled window to respond, reinforcing the boundary they'd spent years ignoring. What surprised me most was how quickly leadership turned on each other once I wasn't there to quietly absorb blame. Meetings became circular, fingers pointed, and the phrase, "this wasn't documented," was thrown around like an accusation, as if documentation magically appears when you refuse to give someone time to create it. One afternoon, Jenna called me in tears, saying she'd been asked to take over responsibilities she didn't have authority for, and I talked her through how to protect herself without burning bridges, because I knew exactly how easy it is to get trapped in that cycle. That night, after my daughter went to bed, I updated my LinkedIn to reflect my consulting work, half expecting nothing to come of it, and woke up the next morning to 3 messages from recruiters who had somehow missed me before. One of them mentioned a director role at a logistics firm with actual staffing support, and a leadership team that valued process over heroics. And as I read the job description, something inside me loosened. For years, I'd been convinced my worth was tied to one company's dysfunction, that leaving would mean starting over from zero. But here was proof that my skills traveled just fine without them. When Aaron emailed later that day asking if I could extend my contract another month, given how critical things were, I realized the irony was complete. They had fired me for being a risk, and now I was the only thing standing between them and collapse. I told Aaron I'd think about extending, which was corporate speak for no, but I wanted to see how far they'd go before admitting the real problem wasn't timelines or vendors, it was leadership. That same afternoon, I had my first interview with the logistics firm, and the contrast was jarring in the best way. They asked thoughtful questions, wanted examples of how I built systems that didn't rely on burnout, and when I talked about documentation and redundancy, no one rolled their eyes. I hung up feeling cautiously hopeful, the kind of hope you don't let yourself feel until you're sure it won't be punished. Meanwhile, back at my former company, the situation deteriorated fast. A compliance audit they'd delayed for months suddenly got scheduled, and the prep work I used to handle quietly was now scattered across 3 teams who didn't talk to each other. Monique emailed me with increasing urgency, asking if I could just review a set of documents, and I replied by pointing to the clause in my contract that defined scope, attaching my invoice for additional work. The shift in tone was immediate, like someone realizing the floor beneath them wasn't solid anymore. I started hearing rumors through the grapevine about the board asking uncomfortable questions, about Aaron being pulled into closed-door meetings, about the internal source who'd reported me now being under scrutiny themselves. I didn't feel smug exactly, but I did feel vindicated. For years, I'd carried the unspoken assumption that if things went wrong, it would somehow be my fault. And watching that narrative unravel without me there to prop it up was oddly healing. When Aaron finally called and admitted they were considering restructuring leadership roles, hinting that there might be an opportunity for me to return in a more senior capacity, I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I thanked him for thinking of me and said I was exploring other options. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, realizing how surreal it was that the same place that had escorted me out was now circling back with offers they never would have made if I'd stayed quiet. For the first time, I understood that walking away hadn't closed a door. It had forced them to see the room differently. The next morning, I got the second-round interview invite from the logistics firm, and I took it in my car like a teenager hiding from her own life, parked 2 blocks away from my daughter's school because I didn't want her to overhear me pitching my leadership style while she practiced spelling words in the back seat. The interviewer, a woman named Patrice, didn't do the fake friendly thing. She got straight to it and asked me what happened at my last job, and I told the truth in the most professional way I could manage. I was terminated suddenly over an alleged policy violation. I consulted afterward to ensure continuity, and I learned I'd been carrying far more critical operations than leadership understood. Patrice didn't flinch or lecture me about loyalty. She asked what safeguards I'd put in place if I joined their team so no single person became a bottleneck. That question alone made me want the job, because it proved she understood the difference between indispensable and exploited. While I was still riding that small wave of being seen, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna. "They're blaming you." My stomach dropped, not because I cared what Erin thought anymore, but because I knew the pattern. When leadership panics, they rewrite history so the scapegoat is always the person who isn't in the room to defend herself. Jenna said an email had gone out internally, framing my termination as a necessary action due to trust concerns. And now the operational issues were being described as growing pains during transition. In other words, it wasn't that they fired the wrong person, it was that the company was bravely adjusting to my absence. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling that old familiar heat of being misrepresented, and then, unexpectedly, I felt calm, because I had receipts, not petty screenshots, not gossip, but the contract, the invoices, the emails where they begged for help, the documented fixes I'd made since being fired, and I hadn't even realized I'd been collecting proof until that moment. That afternoon, Erin emailed me again asking for an extension, and he added one line that made my jaw tighten. "Given the sensitivity of recent communications, we'd appreciate your discretion." Discretion. Like I was the risk, not the people who detonated their own operations out of ego. I replied with a polite refusal to extend beyond the original contract end date and attached my final invoice. Then I forwarded his email to my personal folder labeled "just in case," and for the first time, I started to suspect this wasn't going to end quietly. A week before my consulting contract ended, Patrice called to offer me the logistics job, and I had to mute myself for a second because I made this embarrassing little sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The salary was higher, the benefits were real, and the title came with actual authority instead of the fake ownership my old company loved to hand out when they didn't want to pay. I accepted on the spot, then sat there in silence for a minute with my hand on my chest, like I could physically hold my heart in place. That same day, as if the universe wanted a neat little montage, my former company's drama escalated. Monique scheduled an exit wrap-up call for the following morning, which I assumed was procedural until the calendar invite included someone I'd never met, a corporate attorney. When the call started, Erin sounded like he'd swallowed sand, and the attorney introduced herself and said they wanted to clarify certain aspects of my outside employment, because apparently someone had now decided the original termination needed to be justified retroactively in case I spoke up. It was so obvious it was almost funny. They asked if I'd ever shared confidential information, if I'd ever accessed systems for personal gain, if my volunteer work had been a cover for competitive engagement, and I kept my voice level while answering truthfully, because the truth was boring. I'd never done anything illegal or unethical, and I'd been careful to the point of paranoia. Then the attorney said something that flipped a switch in me. She suggested that my consulting work after termination was proof that my role was transferable and not as critical as I'd implied. I stared at my laptop, genuinely stunned by the logic gymnastics. So I calmly reminded her that the company had initiated the consulting contract, that they'd paid emergency rates because of immediate operational failures, and that every deliverable was documented with timestamps and sign-off emails. There was a pause, then the attorney pivoted to the non-disparagement clause, hinting that negative public commentary could be actionable. That's when the calm in me turned into something sharper. I told them I had no intention of disparaging anyone, but I did intend to correct misinformation if it impacted my professional reputation. Another pause. Erin cleared his throat and said they'd heard rumors I was interviewing elsewhere and wanted to leave on good terms. Good terms after they'd humiliated me and tried to paint me as untrustworthy. I ended the call politely, but my hands were cold afterward because I finally understood what they were doing. They weren't scared of losing me anymore. They were scared I'd stop being silent. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I wrote everything down like I was preparing to testify, not because I planned to sue, but because I'd finally learned that in corporate life, reality only exists if it's documented. I opened a plain Google Doc and started with dates, the firing meeting, the policy accusation, the escort, the consulting contract they begged for, the late-night calls they made once the wheels came off. I pasted in email headers, saved PDFs, exported my invoices, and created a tidy little folder on an external drive labeled Work Do Not Delete, because something in my gut told me they weren't done trying to control the story. On Monday, I started at my new job, and the first day was almost disorienting in its normalcy. No crisis call at 7 a.m., no passive-aggressive Slack pings, no vague quick chat invites that turned into ambushes. Patrice introduced me to my team and said, out loud in front of everyone, "We're glad you're here, and you're empowered to fix what's broken." I smiled like a functioning adult, but inside I felt like I'd stepped into a parallel universe where competence wasn't treated like a personal threat. Then, just as I was settling into the new rhythm, my old company detonated its final grenade. Jenna texted me a screenshot from an internal memo Aaron had sent company-wide, announcing that my position had been eliminated due to a violation of trust and policy, and that leadership was implementing new controls to prevent similar issues. My name wasn't included, but anyone with 2 brain cells could connect it, because I was the only ops manager who'd vanished overnight. My stomach flipped, not from fear, but from the sheer cruelty of rewriting my exit into a morality tale to protect themselves. What made it worse was the timing. They sent it right as I started a new job, right as my LinkedIn updated, right as they knew people would ask questions. It wasn't just damage control, it was a warning. Stay quiet, or we'll keep smearing you. I sat at my desk in my new office, staring at the screenshot while the hum of normal work life carried on around me, and I realized I had a choice. I could swallow it like I'd swallowed everything else, or I could finally stop letting other people narrate my life. That night, after my daughter went to sleep, I opened LinkedIn and drafted a post with shaking hands, not naming the company, not making threats, just telling my story. Terminated without investigation, then immediately rehired as a consultant to patch the operational collapse, then quietly pressured to sign away my voice. I hovered over post for a long time, then clicked it, and felt the strangest thing: relief. The post didn't explode immediately the way viral stories do in your imagination, but it spread in a slow, unsettling way, like a crack in glass that keeps creeping outward when you're not looking. Former coworkers liked it quietly, recruiters commented vague, supportive things, and a few people I barely remembered working with messaged me privately to say, "This happened to me too," which was both validating and heartbreaking. By the next morning, Aaron had viewed my profile, then Monique, then someone from legal, and I watched those little notifications stack up without engaging, because the story was already out of their hands. What I hadn't anticipated was how angry it would make them. That afternoon, I received a formal email from the company's legal department accusing me of violating the non-disparagement clause, attaching screenshots of my own words like evidence, and demanding I remove the post immediately. I forwarded it to a lawyer a friend recommended, expecting to be told to back down, and instead she replied with one sentence that made my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. "They're bluffing." She explained that my post was factual, non-defamatory, and carefully anonymized, and that their clause couldn't legally silence me from correcting the record about my own employment. When she offered to respond on my behalf, I said yes without hesitation, because I was done being the only adult in the room. The response she sent was devastatingly polite, outlining how the company had initiated post-termination consulting due to operational failures, how no investigation had substantiated their claims, and how any further attempts to mischaracterize my conduct would be met with formal action. I never saw the panic, but I felt it in the sudden silence. No more emails, no more calls. The LinkedIn post stayed up, gathering comments and quiet shares. And with every new one, the weight I'd been carrying lightened just a bit. At work, Patrice pulled me aside and said she'd seen the post, that she admired how I handled it, and that if anyone reached out trying to stir trouble, the company had my back. I went home that night and cried, not from stress, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being protected instead of punished. For years, I'd mistaken endurance for professionalism, silence for strength, and loyalty for safety. Sitting on my couch with my daughter's feet tucked under my leg, I realized the story I'd told online wasn't just about being fired, it was about finally deciding I wouldn't help anyone erase me ever again. The fallout took weeks to fully surface, mostly because corporate implosions are rarely loud from the outside. They're quiet and bureaucratic and full of calendar invites that suddenly disappear. Jenna kept me updated in careful fragments, telling me Aaron was on leave, then that an interim ops lead had been installed, then finally that the board had commissioned an external review of leadership decisions tied to turnover and operational risk. Every update landed with less emotional impact than the last, not because it didn't matter, but because I was no longer inside the blast radius. At my new job, I was building something sustainable for the first time in my career, hiring with intention, documenting processes as we went, and actually logging off at a reasonable hour without guilt gnawing at me. One afternoon, while reviewing a project plan, I realized my hands weren't tense anymore, that my shoulders didn't live permanently hunched near my ears, and the thought startled me more than the firing ever had. Then an email came through from a former vendor I'd worked closely with, asking if I was open to consulting independently because, in their words, "You were the only one who ever seemed to know what was actually going on." I smiled, not because I wanted the work, but because it confirmed something important. My value hadn't been defined by one company's willingness to exploit it. Around the same time, a journalist reached out through LinkedIn, saying she was working on a piece about post-pandemic layoffs and corporate retaliation, and asked if I'd be willing to speak anonymously. I declined, not out of fear, but because I didn't need the public vindication anymore. The story had already done its work. Internally, at my old company, the narrative shifted again, this time quietly, with phrases like lessons learned and process failures. And while my name was never publicly cleared, it also wasn't dragged through the mud again. Silence, in this case, felt like surrender. One evening, as I watched my daughter do homework at the kitchen table, she asked why I seemed happier lately, and I told her, honestly, that I'd learned something important about standing up for myself. She nodded like that made perfect sense. And I realized that whatever professional scars I carried, I'd also gained something I could pass on. I hadn't just survived being fired, I'd dismantled the fear that made it possible in the first place. About a month after everything settled, I ran into Monique at a grocery store of all places, standing in the frozen food aisle comparing pizza brands like we were just two exhausted adults trying to get through a weeknight. She froze when she saw me, eyes flicking down to my cart and then back up, and for a split second I saw the version of her that existed outside HR scripts and policy manuals, the one who probably told herself she was just doing her job. We exchanged polite hellos, the kind that carry entire histories under a single word, and she asked how I was doing now, voice cautious. I told her the truth, that I was happy, that my new role was a better fit, and that I finally slept through the night. And I watched something like relief wash over her face, as if she needed permission to believe the story hadn't destroyed me. She hesitated, then said quietly that things at the company were changing, that leadership had underestimated how much knowledge lived in people instead of documents, and that some hard conversations were happening. I nodded, not offering absolution or blame, just acknowledging the reality, because closure doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes it comes with distance. When we parted, I felt lighter than I expected. Not triumphant, not bitter, just done. On the drive home, it hit me that I no longer replayed the firing in my head, no longer fantasized about saying the perfect cutting line in that conference room, no longer needed their regret to validate my experience. At work, my team was thriving, asking smart questions, pushing back appropriately, and watching them advocate for themselves felt like a quiet victory I hadn't planned for, but deeply valued. One afternoon, as I reviewed a budget proposal without dread tightening my chest, I realized the revenge story everyone loves isn't always about watching the villain fall. It's about building a life so steady that their shadow no longer reaches you. I hadn't won because they stumbled. I'd won because I stopped measuring my worth by people who never intended to see it clearly. And that realization, more than any apology or public reckoning, felt like the real ending I'd been moving toward all along. The last time I heard anything concrete about my old company, it came secondhand through a recruiter who didn't realize the connection and casually mentioned they were hiring aggressively for operations roles after a rough internal reckoning. I thanked her, declined, and closed the email without the familiar spike of adrenaline, which felt like a milestone in itself. At this point, my days had settled into something almost boring in the best way. School drop-offs, focused work, honest meetings, dinners where I wasn't half present because my brain was still troubleshooting someone else's emergency. Occasionally, someone new at work would ask why I was so particular about documentation or why I insisted on backup coverage for every role. And I'd smile and say I'd learned the hard way that resilience isn't built on heroes, it's built on systems. I never named names, never framed myself as a victim, because the truth didn't need embellishment. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old email folder, I found the calendar invite for that routine check-in that started everything. And instead of feeling sick, I felt almost grateful because it marked the exact moment my life pivoted away from something unsustainable. Being fired had felt like a public failure at the time, but distance taught me it was actually a private rescue, one I never would have chosen for myself because endurance had become my identity. I thought about how many women I knew who were still holding impossible jobs together with sheer willpower, mistaking exhaustion for dedication, and I hoped, quietly, that they'd get out without needing a dramatic push. That night, as I set my alarm for the next morning, I realized I no longer defined success as being needed at all costs. Success was being respected, being paid fairly, being able to step away without everything collapsing. The company that fired me never apologized, never fully admitted fault, but they also lost the version of me who would have fixed their problems quietly and disappeared again. And I gained something far more valuable than vindication, a career built on choice instead of fear. I don't tell this story often in real life, mostly because it sounds dramatic when compressed into a dinner conversation, and because the lesson doesn't land the way people expect. They want a villain hauled out, a CEO fired, a triumphant return where I walk back into the building and reclaim my desk, but that never happened, And honestly, I'm glad. The real ending is quieter. It's me sitting at my desk now, months later, watching my team solve problems together instead of funneling everything upward. It's my daughter rolling her eyes when I remind her to advocate for herself at school. It's the absence of that constant low-grade fear that one wrong email could cost me everything. I learned that being indispensable isn't power. It's leverage someone else holds over you, and that loyalty without boundaries is just slow self-erasure. When I think back to that conference room, the blinds tilted shut, the paper face down, I don't feel anger anymore, just a strange gratitude that the illusion broke when it did. Being fired forced me to see the truth I'd been avoiding, that no amount of competence will protect you in a system that benefits from your silence, and that the only real security comes from knowing you can walk away. I didn't burn the place down. I didn't sue. I didn't even name them publicly. I simply stopped helping them pretend they were right. And in doing that, I built a career and a life that doesn't require me to disappear so someone else can feel important. If there's a moral here, it's not that companies are evil or that hard work doesn't matter. It's that your value doesn't decrease just because someone decides not to acknowledge it, and the moment you stop begging to be seen is the moment you finally are.